Good morning and welcome to another tax talk. This morning we'll be looking at the FCT versus Resource Capital Fund 3 Limited Partnership in 2014 in the Federal Court of Australia. This is on appeal from a single judge, I believe, in the Federal Court. There are two primary issues in this matter. First of all, where there is an inconsistency between one country and another country's tax laws, when looking at a tax treaty or the interpretation of a tax treaty, which country's tax laws apply. And the second issue is on the valuing of assets, whether they should be looked at individually or whether those assets should be looked at as a whole. In the first instance, this concerned the double taxation agreement. Now, the facts of this matter are that Resource Capital Fund owned a number of shares in a mining company. That mining company had mining rights in Australia, but it had mining information and plant and equipment which were not real property in Australia. The company sold those shares, and in America, the way that it would have been taxed, and this was the taxpayer's argument, is that in America, the limited partnerships are look-through entities, and they're not taxable entities, and only the directors would have been taxed. And so the US law looks at where the directors were. And most of the directors, or all the directors, were US residents, and so they would have been taxed in the US. The taxpayer was trying to rely on a provision of the double taxation agreement to say to the Australian tax office that no, this will already be taxed in US, and so it should be exempt here. The commissioner was arguing, however, that because the limited partnership in Australia is a taxable entity, then the taxation agreement will only apply if the limited partnership was a resident in the US, which is where they have the double taxation agreement. As it turns out, this limited partnership was formed in the Cayman Islands, of course, and so the Australian tax office was saying that the limited partnership was a resident in the Cayman Islands and was not a resident in the US, and therefore the double taxation agreement did not apply, and it was going to tax a Resource Capital Fund on the sale of these shares. Now, the principle is that when a country is considering a double taxation agreement, it will look at the double taxation agreement from the point of view of its own laws, and each country will do the same. So it could be the case that you have two countries interpreting a double taxation agreement in opposite ways. It's like looking at two sides of a coin. One side, the country Australia, is looking at heads, and on the other side, the US is looking at tails. And therefore, each country might levy tax on it. And so the Australian court the federal court found that there was no inconsistency in the double taxation agreement, and that the limited partnership was a resident in the Cayman Islands, and therefore the sale of the Australian assets would be a capital gain. Now, whether it was a capital gain or not, and whether it was taxable, depends on whether whether there was more assets which were Australian owned rather than foreign owned. So it's called TARP, or TARP stands for Taxable Australian Real Property. Now, there were three assets in the bundle for the sale of the shares. There were the mining rights, the mining information, and the plant and equipment. It was not in dispute that the mining information and the plant and equipment were non-Australian real property. However, the mining rights were TARP. They were taxable Australian real property. Now, the court in the first instance valued each of these things separately. They valued the mining rights, the mining information, and the plant and equipment, and the court found that the plant and equipment and the mining information were worth more than the mining rights, and therefore it wasn't to be taxable in Australia. However, the court found that you needed to look at the entirety of the bundle of assets which were being sold and their value collectively. And this was a matter of, this was a principle came out of Spencer versus the Commonwealth. And it's essentially said that the that those assets, the value of the assets, on the assumption of a hypothetical purchaser, would be determined on the assumption that the hypothetical purchaser would be able to use those assets in a manner consistent with their highest and best use. Now, let's just imagine that we have mining information, and mining information could be how much lithium is under a block of land. Mining rights to those land, say if it's Joe's farm. Joe owns a farm and we're not sure what's underneath it. We don't know how valuable it is to mine rights there. Now imagine though, if you had a report from a geologist saying there is a lot of lithium under Joe's farm. Now the mining rights in that instance for Joe's farms becomes a lot more valuable. However, if you just have the mining rights but you don't have the information, then the mining rights are essentially worthless. So in this case, I believe the mining information indicated that the mining rights which were held in Australia were actually incredibly valuable. And therefore the court said you need to combine the mining rights and the mining information together to determine the value of the asset. And so the mining rights, the value of it was dramatically increased. And therefore the federal court in this instance found that there were more TARP assets, or more taxable Australian real property assets, than there were non-TARP assets, and therefore the gain, or the capital gain on the sale of those shares, should be taxed in Australia pursuant to section 85530 of the Act. So this is a very complicated case. There's a lot going on, and I highly recommend that you go and read the case for yourself and go and read the reasoning of the judge to particularly understand what's happening here. So that's the case of the Federal Commissioner of Taxation versus Resource Capital Fund 3, which a limited partnership in 2014. Thanks for joining me.